Chapter 3: Research Methods. Introduction. There are various methods of research. This includes correlation studies, experimental research, survey methods, observational and ex post facto research. The specific research method a researcher employs depends on the aims and objective of the research. The nature of the problem or phenomenon being investigated also determines the method of research to use. Objective. At the completion of this lecture, students will be able to understand each of the methods of research. When they are applied, students will be able to give examples on each of the research methods, highlight the strengths and weaknesses of each of the research methods. Content. Correlation research. This type of research is conducted when the researcher is interested in finding out the relationship or strength of relationship that exists between variables. The study also investigates which of the variables influences and which is actually influenced. For instance, when a researcher is interested in investigating the possible effect of media violence on children and adolescents, exposure to violence on television, and violent behavior among children and adolescents. In correlational studies, quantitative data are used. The results of correlational studies are often interpreted as positive correlation. As one variable increases by 1 unit up, the other variable also increases by 1 unit up, and negative correlation, an increase of 1 unit in one variable brings about a decrease by 1 unit in the other variable or vice versa. There could also be zero correlation, where there is no observable change. The major limitation or disadvantage of this type of research is that we cannot say there is a causal relationship between the variables. Experimental research. This is the most useful scientific method of observation. Experiments are helpful in assisting the researcher to reach the goals of understanding and influencing behavior. It also tells us the relationship that exists between two variables like the correlational research, but experiment allows the researcher to draw conclusions about cause and effect relationship. The researcher has control of the variables of interest. The researcher can actually determine whether a variable can cause a change in another variable, and sometimes by how much, degree, or intensity. The researcher contrives the situations in order to elicit the desired responses in a carefully controlled condition. There are 3 types of experimental research. Feed experiment. In this type of research, the researcher manipulates the independent variables in a predetermined manner and then takes it to a natural setting or environment of the participants of interest. For instance, when a researcher is interested in the effect of physical appearance on actual purchases by consumers. In such a study, the researcher manipulates the dressing pattern of his participants and exposes them to actual market situation where the seller does not know that they are actually participating in a research. Laboratory experiment. In this type of study, the researcher has total control of all the variables of interest that can influence or affect the dependent variables in a simulated environment. The research situation is isolated from what is ordinarily normal to enable the researcher to examine the interplay among the variables in greater details. Asica, 1991. When this is done, when it becomes more evident to say that the manipulated variables actually caused the observed changes in the behavior of interest, provided other plausible extraneous variables have been properly taken care of. One of the limitations of a laboratory experiment is artificiality, since in real-life situations it is difficult to isolate other variables. Fit study. In fit study, type of research, variables are not manipulated or controlled, though the variables exist of themselves in the field. The researcher is only interested in how they can help in predicting their control over other variables. The purpose of field research is to discover some variables of interest in the field situation, discover relationships among them, and also lay a foundation for hypothesis testing. For example, if you are interested in observing the effect of exclusive breastfeeding on IQ of children, this can be achieved in any of these two ways. By studying different groups of children across selected age group like 0 to 10 years, this is a cross-sectional field study. We can also observe a particular set of children over a period of 10 years. This is regarded as longitudinal field study. Survey method. This is the most widely used method of research, particularly in the social sciences. This is the type of research that utilizes interviews, questionnaires, and focus group discussion (FGD) with individuals in the community. It is that branch of social investigation that studies large and small populations by selecting and studying samples chosen from a given population to discover the relative incidence, distribution, and intercorrelation of social and psychological variables. The survey method assumes the impossibility of using the entire population of interest, hence the scientific selection of a sample of the population. It is relatively cheaper to conduct survey research because of its coverage ability at minimal cost. The basic disadvantages of the survey method is that the accuracy of the information collected may be questionable. Answers may not be honest. An example of survey research includes, among others, an investigation on the attitude of students contraceptive, perception on the effectiveness of monthly environmental sanitation exercises, etc. Observational method. Naturalistic observation involves careful observation and recording of behavior in real-life setting. Behavior is watched and observed as it naturally occurs. The researcher does not interfere with the situation. It is based on the assumption that the phenomenon investigated can best be captured in its real-life occurring situation. It is often used for the study of animal behavior. It is also used to study such topics as the play and friendship pattern of young children, the leadership tactics of effective managers, and the way in which juvenile delinquent encourages antisocial behavior in one another. Ex post facto research. In ex post facto type of research, the researcher does not have control of the variables of interest at hand, since their relationship must have occurred, and we are only going after the fact that has already been established. In other words, the event has already taken place. The researcher just wants to confirm this. For example, consider a study that seeks to investigate the effect of anxiety and post-traumatic stress disorder (PTSD) on victims of the last flood disaster in Ibadan. The flooding has already occurred. It is not subject to any manipulation. Likewise, the anxiety. The usual practice in ex post facto research is that it is a kind of retrospective search for the effect or influence of the independent variable on the dependent variable. The major disadvantage is that it lacks precision and the extent of generalization is limited. Summary. In this study, we have learned about the different methods of research, which includes correlation studies, experimental research, survey methods, observational and ex post facto research as some examples of research methods. Correlation studies are conducted when the researcher is interested in finding out the relationship or strength of relationship that exists between variables. In experimental researches, allows the researcher to draw conclusions about cause and effect relationship. The researcher has control of the variables of interest. Types of experimental research include field experiment, laboratory experiment, and field study. Survey research is that branch of social investigation that studies large and small populations by selecting and studying samples chosen from a given population to discover the relative incidence, distribution, and intercorrelation of the variables. It utilizes such instruments like the interviews, questionnaire, FGD, etc. Naturalistic observation involves careful observation and recording of behavior in real-life setting. Finally, the ex post facto research is that kind of retrospective research for the effect or influence of the independent variable on the dependent variable when the interaction has already occurred. This is the end of chapter 3. Thanks for listening.